Welcome to class. We've got just about everybody, so we'll go ahead and get started. Can you guys hear me all right?
Yep.
Great. So the first assignment, the mission statements were graded, and your second assignment, which is the vision, is due today. I just thought I'd open it up if anybody had any comments on the process, any takeaways, questions, any thoughts at all on the stuff that you've done so far. This week, we're going to cover the three-tier system and franchise law. So as I said, kind of at the beginning of this class, at the first half leading up into the midterm is a little bit weighted on the, there's some heavy hiking to do through this regulatory environment, through all the details of licensing and structure. And this week, it's either fascinating or more heavy hiking. It sort of depends on probably personality and how you look at it. I have involved in distribution for a long time, so I have both been fascinated by the woven strategy and restrictions here, but it's also been something I've sort of just had. I've been extremely frustrated by it because there's parts of it that just seem maddening and unfair and confusing. And then it's also been the highlight of my career is kind of getting through some of that and coming out on the other side. So it has a little bit of both, and I'm going to do my best to break it down and just realize too that this is just another step in setting this foundational understanding of the environment we're in, so that then we can figure out how to do what we want to do in our careers, whether we're owning a business or working for somebody else. Understanding the basics of how our business is so different than almost every other business out there is really an important first step. So I also have, we have a relatively lengthy video of the last minute, and I'll set it up more later, but a personal mentor of mine and currently general counsel for the Brewers Association, Mark Serini, gave a talk at the Michigan Brewers Guild Conference, the virtual conference just this last month, basically on the distribution framework of America, where it's been and where we're going. And it was such a great talk, and he's somebody that I've learned from and been a client of and have followed for 20 years. And he really illustrates something. I mean, I learned new things in this talk, watching this talk live. 20 years later, there were some things that I was like, oh, I didn't quite understand that before. So when I started preparing for this class, I thought we have one of the leading minds in the industry speaking to it, and both Mark, the Brewers Association, and the Michigan Brewers Guild generously gave us permission to use that. So I think that's really a treat. He's going to, well, I said I was going to set it up later, and then I started setting up. But anyways, that's part of class today. So we've got about, I don't know, 25, 30 minutes of preparation for that. And then it's about a 35, 40-minute video. Then we got a couple of pieces to sort of wrap up from it. And that should be the class. We'll have a little room for Q&A. So however that works for you, if it affects your timing or comfort levels or when to open a beer, that's what's going on. So with that started, I'm going to share the screen and get busy.
Is the audio choppy for anyone else, or is that me? I just don't know if that's my connection or not.
No, I'm getting a lot of breakup too.
Yeah, same here.
Thank you for telling me. Okay, so the premise here to understand what we're getting into in franchise law, it starts to just illustrate this basic divide of, the build it and they will come model of we're going to have on-site sales, we're going to sell directly to the customer, this pub model. and whether or not you're going into distribution, you're going to bring the product. I've always said bringing beer to the people. We're talking about bringing beer and spirits to the people. But you have this brewery, the distillery, this idea of the producer. So there's a divide here. There's different ways it'll show up in different areas, but just realize that treating on-site sales are going to be treated significantly differently than distribution. And that's part of what we're going to explore, the different ways that changes. So, okay, this is going to take us through sort of illustrating what we mean when we talk about the 3-tier system. It's really, you can think of it as it's both a description in terms of it's describing the makeup of our marketplace and environment, but it's also ends up being that term comes from a regulatory decision to define these tiers as different things. So the first tier is the producer, the brewery or distillery. Now, this is not, there's a lot of these words that end up being interchangeable in the industry, but you add importer to that and you have what I put in quotes as supplier. So really the supply side is the first tier, because now the importer is not making anything necessarily. They are acting as an agent of the maker who's not domestic, who's not in this country. So you're treating them as proxy for the producer. Therefore, they're in the supplier tier, right? So in the US, the maker or the representative of the maker is the supplier / producer, which we're referring to as the first tier here. Then you go into the second tier. And so they're identifying that the distribution is done by a separate organization, which again, here's another place for interchangeable terms that can get confusing, especially as you change states, is that whether they're a wholesaler or a distributor is semantics. So we're looking at that as, for now anyways, roughly the same thing. But then you get into certain states like Pennsylvania, and they refer to retailers, bottle shops, as distributors. So there are moments where this doesn't work out, but out in the trade, you're going to hear people refer to it as both ways. So the wholesaler, the organizations that can collect multiple brands into one organization and warehouse to then distribute to the retail trade, is the second tier. So they are not making things, they are responsible for that sale to the retail trade. So then you have the third tier, which are retailers. So I've made these different shapes and different colors for a reason. And in retail, you have the diversity of, you have off-premise and on-premise. So we talked about that last week, I think. On-premise is a retailer who's selling the alcohol with the expectation that and the permission that it's going to be consumed on site, on their premises. An off-premise retailer is selling that alcohol with the restrictions that it be consumed elsewhere off of their premises. So now we'll get later into exceptions and stuff. So some of the things like in some states, Whole Foods has a bar in their store. That is a blending. That is a modification of what the traditional tiers would, the traditional off-premise. They're still a retailer either way, but they are bringing some on-premise permissions into an off-premise site. But to start things off, just think about these clear divisions of which is it? Is it a store or a restaurant, bar, etc.? Then I have this other shade of blue off to the right, because you have other retailers. You have an event. And so again, depending on where you are, these are done differently. In Michigan, to get a special event license, you need to be a nonprofit. Some other places you might be able to get a one-day event license where you're acting as a retailer, because so that just means that whatever the rules are for retailers, are you required to buy from a wholesaler? Do what is your licensing requirements? Those are examples of a retailer that may not look as traditional, or you might not think of as a retailer. But once you do think of them as a retailer, you'll better understand the pathways for things to happen. So if there's a beer festival or a whiskey festival, how are they getting their product? You need to be thinking of them as part of the third tier. And then once you understand those rules and regulations, you'll know which gets activated and why. And then furthermore, those events are using on-premise conditions. So they're going to need both that permission, and then they're going to need whatever relevant things apply, like insurance, et cetera. So you're going to have different insurance exposure. This isn't a rule, but it's sort of a reality of understanding why there's a difference. If somebody's drinking alcohol on your property, you have a different exposure than if they're buying it and taking it home. So anyways, recognizing that retailer is a little bit more than just the two clear examples that we see in the marketplace. Okay, so what we've known as traditional for a long time is that, and then we have the consumer. Sorry, I was jumping ahead. So we have these happy dancing consumers because they have access to wonderful beer, wine, and spirits. So what's been traditional for a long time is this idea that the supplier, the first tier, sells to the wholesaler. The wholesaler sells to the retail trade. That's the criteria. That's the both the description and the sort of refined structure of licensing, et cetera, for the three tiers. So each of those have different licenses. Each of those have different rules. And that's what we've known for a long time as the way it is. Now, we're going to get into what some of the ramifications, some of the other regulatory environment, besides the fact that these three tiers are separate and have different opportunities or permissions. There are other laws that come in within these tiers and start affecting how they relate to one another, and we'll get to that in a second. But the three-tier system itself is this structure. Now, we've also had some exceptions, which we've talked about along the way. So first one is self-distribution. So that you can see, what I wanted to illustrate here is how it relates to tiers. So you have the first tier selling to the retail, to the third tier. So they are skipping the second tier, which is why there's debate usually about whether self-distribution should be allowed, because they are, one second. Oh yeah, okay. There's usually debate about self-distribution from the wholesalers because that's business that was required to go through them previously and is now going around them. So they're going to want to have a voice in that conversation of whether or not that's a good idea. And they would have self-interest in saying, hey, what about us? Our business model was built on moving that product. So, and then we have another exception. And back to self-distribution for a minute. There's different ways to do that too. So they can either say a brewer's license is allowed to deliver product to the retail trade according to these conditions, or they can say a first tier producer is allowed to concurrently hold a wholesaler license. So they're allowing the first tier to act as a second tier. So then all the second tier regs apply because it's not really a brewer delivering to the retailer. It's that a brewer or distiller was able to also hold a wholesaler license. So when they're at the retailer, they're acting as a wholesaler. It just happens to have ownership interests from the supplier. So there's a couple of ways a state could organize that. Just food for thought. And I think it helps to just continually put this through the filter of how does that look between the three tiers, and why it matters will hopefully become more apparent as we go through. Then we have consumers, and the arrow is a little different direction. So consumers going on site and buying from the producer. So tasting rooms, tours, beer to go, brew pubs. That is an example of both the third tier and the second tier being skipped or cut out, or it probably depends on who you are, what business you represent, as to whether you see that being cut out or a great opportunity for the consumer. But in either case, recognizing that those on-site sales are a alteration of the tier structure is just going to help you understand why certain things kick in, and also why, when this, we talked last week about the legislation change, why certain people had an opinion or a voice about what was good or bad about it. But that is an exception. That is a revision to the initial three-tier system. Okay, so the left side of the screen here is really talking about franchise law. And franchise law are the rules around the franchisee, which would be the second tier, the distributor, and the franchisor, which would be the supplier. So this is saying that the first tier is the brand owner. So if I'm making Fred's whiskey and the distributor is going to sell Fred's whiskey to a retailer, they're acting as an agent for my brand. So that has some similarities to thinking about if you own a restaurant, but you are a franchise, you are branded as the franchisor. There's another organization that owns the brand and the recipes and the sort of identity, and you own the building and you manage the employees and you have a licensing agreement with that parent brand. Now, this is not the same thing, but it's borrowing terms from it. So that model, that understanding sort of helps in that. That's what is kicking in here, is saying that the second tier, the distributor who's acting as this agent and has distribution rights and is representing that brand, that, and Mark will get into this in much more detail, but it's identifying, it's regulating the relationship between these two. And oftentimes it's there to protect the franchisee from the franchisor. So if I built a warehouse and bought trucks and put your brand name on them, and my business was dependent on this relationship that we agreed on, which was that I get to sell your whiskey or beer, that if you then if you said I can no longer sell your product, and I had invested all this money and built this business, I'm kind of in trouble. So this is saying we're going to see this, we're going to protect these rights with franchise law so that those businesses are protected from unfair practices. Now, how that gets historically played out is another story, but that's the idea of franchise law, is it's regulating the brand representation, the distribution rights related to brands of the suppliers being sold at the distributor. Now, Tied House gets mentioned in a lot of places, and Tied House is separate, and I just put that over on the right-hand side of the screen. So Tied House laws are saying that one of the first two tiers, the supplier or the distributor, are not allowed to own, and then in various interpretations, various state laws will do this differently. But so I added unduly influence or leverage the third tier. So in other words, Budweiser isn't allowed to own a bar in a state that has Tied House laws. In a state that doesn't, perhaps they could. In Europe, they, rarely do they have Tied House laws. So you see breweries owning tasting rooms, and it's the only brand sold there. And then the unduly influenced or leveraged mean sometimes there's a way around that where they don't own the bar, but they loaned them a bunch of money and say, you have to sell all our, they sort of own them without actually owning the property. So tied house law is a prohibition of that relationship. And there's a separation that's boxes in the middle of those first two tiers being on the top and the third tier on the bottom, because it's intended to create a distance between those tiers. So again, if you go back to last week's conversation about business models, you can see how this consumer coming into a tasting room where they're only able to buy your beer looks like a tied house law, except that it's the brewery itself versus the brewery owning a retailer. But the actions that the consumer's experiencing have some similarities, because there's an environment controlled by the brand owner and producer, where they have exclusive access to the consumer. So these exceptions have been made and accepted. But if that retailer were a separate company, that would not be allowed in a state with tied house laws, which Michigan is one. So hopefully that has some clarity in terms of what we're doing here. So on the next slide, we've got more ideas about what it means. So what is franchise law? And so, like I said, it's this relationship between the first and second tier. And generally speaking, not generally speaking, those rules are established in the states. So the state will determine what this relationship should be made up of. These are typical features of this so again, you could have a state that does not have these laws at all, or a state that has less restrictive version. You see a lot of similar things because they frequently borrow from one another. As one law passes, one state might have passed it ahead of the others, and then they say, well, that's interesting, we're going to look at that language and then write our own. So there's just the first point is that they're regulated by the state. The second point is that they create exclusive wholesale territories. And so one way to think about that is it can be confusing, because you say exclusive wholesale territories, except this brewer has 3 wholesalers, or how does that work? They're not exclusive, meaning that they're the only wholesaler that can have my brand. They're exclusive in their relationship to a retailer or a region, right? So there's a distribution right assigned geographically. So in Kent County, however it's determined between the organizations, counties are frequent territory lines, but it can be whatever they figure out. So in Kent County, the retailer has to buy Fred's beer from this one wholesaler. Now, I could have a second wholesaler in Kalamazoo who covers Kalamazoo County, and they might also distribute products to Kent County. But if I have a contract with another wholesaler for my rights, for Fred's beer rights in Kent County, my Kalamazoo distributor can't deliver there. So they have to find a way to put that in their catalog and explain, we have the rights for Kalamazoo County, not for Kent County. And of course, that's gotten a little easier with the digital universe. But that basic idea is that for any given territory, the retailer has one place to go for the branded product. So it also creates distribution rights as a transferable asset. So that's a fancy phrase, but it's an important one to understand, is that if distributor owns the rights to Fred's beer, they can sell them. There's a quantifiable market value to the rights to my beer. So it means that they can sell it, they could pass it on, generationally. When a child takes over the business, there can be a transfer, but they could also say, I don't want to sell that beer anymore. I'm staying in business. I'm not transferring the ownership of the business. I don't want to sell this particular, I don't want to distribute this brand anymore. So I'm going to move the rights from my distributor to some other distributor, but they're going to have to pay for them because this is worth a certain amount of money. And how they calculate that is sort of another conversation. But think of it that it's basically appraised for its market value and what the going rate is. And the debate can ensue over it's worth this much, it's not. But that idea that the ability to just the right to distribute that brand is now an asset really changed a lot, changes the game, because now it's also sort of, they can borrow against it, they can invest against it. They say, well, we have this and it's worth X amount of money, so my business is worth that amount of money. And so that will come up again later. So good cause termination, I didn't write a lot here because it's sort of an interesting thing, but I could have said it requires good cause termination. Now this will change from state to state, but again, a typical premise in franchise law is that a supplier can't leave for no reason. So what makes good cause? Well, that's in the code, and that could depend on what the state says. Some of them just say good cause. So you have to demonstrate a failure of execution, a significant, business reason, similar to sort of an employment agreement. If you needed to show good cause, you'd have to really demonstrate that there was a reason. And that also means that if you're going to demonstrate there's a reason, they can tell you that you're not right. The argument is allowed now, because if you have to demonstrate good cause with it, then an attorney can tell you didn't have it. Yes, I did. No, I didn't. So now there's this there's this seam at, if the supplier wants to leave the wholesaler, there's rules they have to demonstrate, which is very difficult. Sort of a side note, but the feature of franchise law is that it exists. So there's also, so related to that, and related to the first, those two, both the asset and the good cause, is that there's restrictions on the disapproval of the sale of brand rights. So if you're going to sell the rights to another wholesaler, there are different ways they write it, but basically I need to have a significant business reason to disapprove that transfer. Some are lighter than others, but they're also, so they're not only restricting a supplier from firing the wholesaler, saying, listen, you can't represent my product anymore. They're also saying, if the wholesaler says, I'm going to sell it from distributor A to distributor B, you, supplier, have to go along with that sale. Otherwise, you're damaging my asset. And so if I don't like distributor B, I got to now prove why they're not capable of selling my beer. I can't just say, I don't like distributor B, I don't want to go there, it's my beer. So that transfer or inability to disapprove of a sale is another big feature. And then another feature is that they generally state that this cannot be waived by agreement, meaning the state law, the franchise code on the books, supersedes any agreement the two parties might have. So if a wholesaler says, listen, don't worry about the franchise law, you and I are cool, I'll let you out, that agreement is not valid, or that clause in an agreement is going to be overrun by the state code that says, no, franchise law applies regardless of what your agreement says. If it's a related activity, then state law trumps your agreement. So that's a significant feature to think about. And Mark will touch on that a little bit more. So what's the difference between three-tier system and franchise law? I just wanted to reiterate that the three-tier system regulates the roles and some of the rules of each tier. But franchise law is regulating the distribution rights and the relationship between first and second tiers. Brand owner, brand distributor, franchise law. But the tier is more the larger environment. So that's a good place to pause. We got the video here coming up in a second. Does anybody have questions at this point? Go ahead.
What if a distributor doesn't want to pick up your brand in the first place? Like, what if you think you have a good product, sales are doing pretty well, but for whatever reason, like, so you have to go through a distributor, but no one wants to take you? Has that even happened before, or is that just a crazy hypothetical?
Yeah, it can happen, and it's sort of, so that's sort of before you have these problems, but sometimes the franchise law is creating the problem. It's because it's created a duopoly where there's two wholesalers in town, they own all the rights, they feel they have enough, and that will get covered. Mark talks about it in a little bit.
Okay.
Not specifically. The reality is sometimes there's been an argument made that that's preventing an access to market. So that shows up a little bit more in legislative battles of saying, hey, wholesalers, we've got examples of a brewer not being able to get picked up by anybody. So that gets used to make an argument for self-distribution. So saying, if everybody's getting picked up and there's no problems here, and we feel that every brewer has access to the marketplace, then there's no need for self-distribution. At this point, they can't really make that case. So you can't force a distributor to pick up a brand, but there's a lot of sort of sidebar conversations of saying, come on, be realistic here. And usually they loosen their grip, but it's tricky. And we'll get into the difference between the rules and strategy in a second. But so that creates a strategy problem to get solved by the brewer of saying, I'm having trouble getting a distributor in this market. What do I do now? So there's no one answer there. And it's also different if it's your home market versus a far field market, because the far field market goes, well, I guess there's no call for your brand. You're not entitled to sell in Kansas. So if nobody's looking to pick your brand up, you got to work harder. So there's that kind of free market reality too, that you're entitled. I think there's a belief that there's a general enforcement of fairness in the marketplace, but that's different than saying all brands should make it.
How can you argue that someone wouldn't be calling for your product though if you don't have a distributor and can't sell? Like, how could people of Kansas even ask for my brand if I can't sell it to them in the first place?
Exactly.
I guess how does that?
Exactly. So there's some
people
really
from Kansas have to find me and then tell who that, like, I want Hannah's beer to come to Kansas.
right. And so let's make sure if there's any part of this that doesn't get covered, let's bring it back up on the tailing slides, because when we talk about strategy, well, also there's week 11 is sales and distribution. So I actually pulled some slides out of what I almost put in this week, because it's really sales and distribution strategy overall is a whole nother chapter, right? So right now, figuring out sort of the framework, and I'll be glad to touch on that a little bit, especially if there's time, but figuring out how to counter it and how to work through it is like another set of skills versus just understanding what you can and can't do, and even who the players are. and what some of these terms mean. So, because if you're starting it out and you just wanted to make beer, and now somebody's talking about tiers and franchise, it doesn't even make any sense without a primer. It's just out of left field. So that's why we're starting here. But that brings up a common spot where people get hung up. Okay, so I think I'm at the right spot where we're going to pick up right in Mark's introduction. And again, as part of the setup, he's going to cover, I decided to leave it in because he covers some of the history, the prohibition stuff, and goes into some interesting detail, things we covered in the first week that he illustrates in some new ways. And I just thought it'd help reinforce how this stuff came to be. So here's Mark Serini.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mark Serini, General Counsel of the Brewers Association, and I'm delighted to be talking to you here today. I have been at the craft brewing legal advice business for over 25 years, most of it as a partner at McDermott, Will & Emery. And then earlier this year, I made the really, really pleasant leap to go in-house and dedicate myself 100% to America's small and independent brewers. So looking forward to our next opportunity to meet live, but in the meantime, we're going to have to survive with the tyranny of WebEx and PowerPoint. So what I want to talk to you today about is really access to markets or distribution in America, and really take a look at the 85-year sweep since Prohibition to today and hint at where we may be going in the next 5 to 10 years. And I love getting into the history of this, not simply because I'm a history major by training pre-law school, but also because history matters. And history matters especially because in this industry, we've been trained to think that the alcohol beverage regulatory system has been this unchanging, shining castle on the hill or burnt shack on the hill, depending on your perspective. And instead, what I'm going to really emphasize here is this has been a continual evolution for the last 80 plus years, and that we will see additional evolution coming, particularly from the efforts of small brewers and others as the marketplace evolves. So without further ado, let's start with the beginning of post-prohibition alcohol regulation, which starts with prohibition. Everybody knows at least the basic outlines of the story. The 18th Amendment bans the consumption or trafficking of intoxicating liquors. It was enacted in 1919, although a couple of things to remember. Number one, states were going dry well before 1919. In fact, the first ones were pre-Civil War. Then the Prohibition movement sort of peters out because we had better things to do, like fight a civil war. And then beginning in the 1870s, states start going dry again. And then also you had wartime rationing beginning in 1917, where it was very, very hard for brewers and distillers to produce because grain was largely being put to the war effort. But right after the passage of the 18th Amendment, you have the infamous Volstead Act, clearly one of the most hated pieces of legislation in the history of this country, perhaps up there with the Alien and Sedition Act under the Adams administration. And among other things, it's the ultimate unfunded mandate. It says, here's this behavior that so many Americans engage in. You, local and state police, sheriffs, etc., have to stamp this out, and we're not going to appropriate a nickel to help you. So here you go, folks, with your existing resources, try to do this. Well, not surprisingly, this was not very well enforced. You had widespread disrespect for the law. Respectable citizens suddenly became fashionable to go to the speakeasy and have your underground cocktail. And who's going to supply this when you have a market that is very profitable, but there's no licit market? You have a black market develop, and that black market has to be defended by guys with Tommy guns. And so you have this very violent underworld that comes up. And then you also have trafficking in products that are unsafe, right? No FDA oversight, no other health and safety oversight. So people are drinking denatured alcohol, people are going blind. It's very bad. So by the early 1930s, the tide has turned. I would say half of the tide turning can be attributed to those secondary effects. Hey, the cure here was worse than the disease. We now have a massive violent crime problem, et cetera. We've corrupted police departments, but we also have the beginning in 1929 of the Great Depression. And so those excise tax revenues, which were, excise taxes were a much bigger part of the federal revenue stream pre-prohibition than they are today. And so that starts looking pretty good. So along comes the 21st Amendment. And as many of you in the beer industry know, that comes in two phases. First, as the 21st Amendment is making its way through the legislature or through the states, you have Congress say, well, we talked about intoxicating liquor, but 3.2 beer isn't really intoxicating. So we're going to declare that it's non-intoxicating. So beer becomes legal, repeal arrives for beer in early 1933, and then in December 1933, the 21st Amendment is ratified. Now, this is one of the most important points. You will hear over and over, oh yes, the 21st Amendment established a three-tier system. I'm here to tell you that's absolutely wrong. The 21st Amendment's first section repeals the 18th. The third section's procedural. The second section says that the importation or transportation into a state in violation of the state's laws is illegal. Well, what that is jurisdictional. Indeed, it would empower a state to ban a three-tier system and mandate vertical integration just as much as it could support a three-tier system. So the idea that the 21st Amendment mandates or requires a three-tier system is just totally false. So what happens? Well, first of all, at the federal level, Congress, initially, the newly regulated or newly legalized industry has to be regulated. And President Roosevelt is regulating half the economy under the National Recovery Act, which pretty much said, well, Mr. President, go fix our economy, and we're going to give you appropriations and power to do so. So in 1935, the Supreme Court says, well, we're supposed to have a system where the law is made by Congress. Congress, you can't just punt completely to the president. It violates the non-delegation doctrine. So Congress has to fill in all these gaps, one of which is the regulation of alcohol. So in 1935, they enact the Federal Alcohol Administration Act. That was very slightly amended shortly after its passage. And then you have the addition, the overlay of the Beer Labeling Act of 1988, which requires the government warning statement. But for the most part, that's been unchanged ever since. And so it's got the familiar things like COLAs, basic permits, advertising mandatories, the consignment sale ban, the federal tied house law. For states, of course, there's no single answer, but a lot comes from a book founded by the Rockefeller Foundation called Toward Liquor Control. Two authors, Fosdick and Scott. Fosdick, in fact, later became the head of the Rockefeller Foundation, and they studied alcohol. They actually borrowed a lot from a pre-prohibition study called the Commission of 50, and they came up with a set of recommendations. Now, there's a lot of people who will also say, oh yes, Toward Liquor Control established a three-tier system or recommended one. In fact, I saw a paper recently out of Michigan that made that statement. It's absolutely not true. There is nothing in Toward Liquor Control requiring or advocating for a three-tier system. In fact, the primary motive or the primary advocacy in Toward Liquor Control was, well, we shouldn't have private sale of alcohol at all. Everything should be a control system. There should never, ever be a saloon. The only alcohol that you should be able to be sold outside of state liquor stores would be restaurants could have table wine, and then 3.2 beer could be sold elsewhere, nothing else. But they have a chapter that says, well, we recognize that politically that's probably not going to happen in every state. And so if you're going to have private retail and a licensing system, here are 10 recommendations, one of which is a tied house law, just like the feds had a tied house law. But tied house does not mandate a three-tier system. We'll get into that in a second. So I haven't found any evidence of a three-tier system in the 1930s. And in fact, Well, for any of you who are lawyers, you know that doing research before about 1990 is much harder because you have to actually go to books. And so trying to research the original post-prohibition statutes in the 1930s is very difficult. I did have a intrepid associate about 6 years ago, it was 2014, do the research in the 5 biggest states. Not a single one of them had mandatory 3-tier. And of course, there's 2 sides to that coin. Can the brewers sell directly to retailers? As you'll see from this summary, the answer is yes. And then the second thing, which is, or could they also own their own wholesaler? The answer is yes, with the exception of Texas, where it would be yes, but only if you were an in-state brewer. Texas had residency requirements, ironically, until the mid-1990s, when Southern Wine and Spirits came along and said, we want to get into the Texas market, and had those residency requirements for wholesalers struck down as unconstitutional. Now, so back to Tide House. It is very clear that the architects of post-prohibition laws thought there should be Tide House laws, but the Tide House law was to keep the retailer, that 3rd-tier member, separate from everybody else. And in fact, if you look at the nomenclature of the Federal Alcohol Administration Act, there's retailer, a defined term, right? And we know what retailers are. And then there was industry member, and that was wholesalers, that was importers, that was brewers, that was wineries, that was distilleries. Those were all the big bad guys that we were protecting the poor little retailer from with these Tide House laws. So at most, it was a mandatory 2-tier system. However, you can see how that helps lay the groundwork for, 20, 30, 40 years later, mandatory 3-tier, because you already have the structural separation in the code, which then you could perhaps tweak to say, oh, by the way, not only does the producer have to be separate from the retailer, but they have to be separate from the wholesaler as well. And then what does politics play? Of course, a huge role. Wholesalers in the post-World War II era start getting more powerful. The people who depended on local distribution, which was typically the quote old regional breweries, they're declining. And then the national brewers that, other than in their local area, they generally have to rely on wholesalers. They're not going to create that massive system of trucks and warehouses nationally, so they have to rely on wholesalers. So all those political factors drive 3-tier mandates later on. And today you hear people say, like, oh, that's a loophole. I mean, a New York wholesaler can be owned by a big brewer. Oh, that's a loophole. No. That's not a loophole. That's a reflection of the original architecture in the post-prohibition era. And the FAA Act is as well. The FAA Act clearly mandates separation between retailers and other industry members, but there's no hint at a 1st, 2nd-tier separation. Some of you may know people at some of the few remaining old regional breweries. I've talked to Nick Matt and Fred Matt about this. And as late as the 1960s, Matt Brewing Company was engaged in self-distribution in their local market. Almost all of these companies will have records, at least, of self-distribution in their not too distant past. And then even look at the big brewers. To this day, CDC, Coors Distributing Company, is the largest distributor in Colorado. I can remember when Anheuser-Busch, and this was in my time in the industry, finally gave up its distribution operation in Missouri. Wisconsin was even later. It was in the 2000s. I can actually remember because soon after Miller sold its operation, presumably to one of its favored consolidators, then immediately the law was changed by the local distributors, I'm sure, or at least promoting that law, to prohibit 1st, 2nd-tier integration for most brewers. So I haven't done a national survey and traced this out. But by the way, I think every guild needs to do this homework in their home state to figure out when it was. But as far as I can tell, 3-tier mandates, the legal separation between the brewer and or the producer and the wholesaler begins in the late 1940s, and it doesn't begin with brewers. It begins with spirits. And that makes sense, right? Because politically, while there were local brewers in most states as late as the 1950s and 60s, pre-craft beer, there was not a whole lot of local distillers. The industry was concentrated in a few places like Kentucky and Tennessee. And of course, it was a much more expensive proposition, especially back then. You know, coming out of Prohibition shifted U.S. consumption patterns strongly towards spirits, and so it was probably the most lucrative part of the market. But by the 1960s, the wholesalers have really started pushing these laws, and you start seeing this concept of the three-tier system emerging from the lexicon. But again, just to emphasize, just in your neighborhood here, Illinois and Wisconsin became mandatory, and only partial because there's exceptions for small guys, but partial mandatory three-tier states really within the last 25 years. Again, don't you see the pattern? It's an evolving system. Oh, and then finally, just some examples of states that are not mandatory three-tier to this day. California, not for beer and wine, and for spirits, it's only for true distillers, not for rectifiers and not for brandy. It's a wine state, so no surprise that brandy gets exempted. Colorado, New York, Pennsylvania, if you looked at the law, you would say, gee, there's a prohibition on a brewer owning a distributor, but in Pennsylvania, a distributor, without the word importing, is basically a off-premise beer shop, and an importing distributor is what we consider a mainline distributor, and a Pennsylvania brewer can sell directly to distributors. So again, not a mandatory three-tier state. Here's another set of laws that we talk about, and sort of I have seen over the years commentators say, these relics of prohibition. Well, beer franchise laws begin in the 1970s. And by the way, you'll note whenever I do a presentation on this subject, I put franchise in quotes initially. And the reason for that is that there are in 17 states what I call true franchise laws. And those are the laws that would protect, a Burger King and McDonald's franchisee from their corporate franchisor. But they have tests that really reflect the fact that that franchisee is almost 100% reliant on the franchisor's trademark and business methods in order to survive. And because you had a lot of mom and pops, and they wanted to protect those mom and pops from getting taken out by the corporate store once they had built up the market, the taste for the local McDonald's or Kentucky Fried Chicken, which was the pioneer of franchising in this country, they passed these laws in about 17 states. There haven't been a new franchise law, I believe, general franchise law, in quite a long time. But the point is that they really reflect this massive, dependence on the franchisor by the franchisee. That's not the way it works in beer franchise laws. Beer franchise laws, if you sell one case to the distributor in most states, there are a few exceptions, you're bound. So what other features are we talking about when we talk franchise law? By the way, for you distributing brewers, this is all, I'm sure, old hat, but just for everybody's benefit, they typically say you can only terminate a contract for good cause, and more importantly, you can only not renew the contract for good cause. They restrict brewers from disapproving the sale or either of the business of the wholesaler or particular distribution rights. And think about that. What a revolution. This monetizes the brewer's goodwill for the benefit of the distributor. You could view it as a massive transfer in wealth from the producer to the wholesaler. And suddenly it gave the wholesalers something real and almost impossible to lose, right? Losing a distributorship right for good cause is almost like if you screw up on your trademark filings and you abandon your trademark. Yes, it happens, it can happen, but it almost never does. And so it gives wholesalers a property right in that brand. And then most importantly, perhaps, to understand why it's so key is you can't waive them by contract, or you can waive, you still need contracts, by the way, because contracts are what establishes the performance that might give a brewer a chance to say there's good cause. But if there are provisions dictating a particular thing, such as you have to show good cause, you can't waive that by contract. So very, very favorable laws to the wholesalers. Now think back to the 70s and 80s. The regional brewers, those old regionals, and there were like 800 of them, in the 1930s. But by the 70s, they're all dead or in serious decline. Their power has waned to almost nothing. And now you have the rise of the giant national brewers. Anheuser-Busch, Schlitz in the early 1970s and mid 1970s was still the #2 brewer. And then Miller, with the money from Philip Morris, kind of takes over later in the 70s. You have the rise of Coors, but you have this handful of large national businesses. And who are they dealing with? Well, back then, wholesalers were largely unconsolidated mom and pop businesses. I mean, truly, they didn't have in-house lawyers. They didn't have a lot of money for outside lawyers. They were operating in just a few counties. And so now you can say, well, there was some logic to look at this a little bit like that conventional franchise, where you've got this disparity of bargaining power between the big bad national brewer and this poor mom and pop. And they said, contract law isn't going to protect these poor mom and pops because they don't even have lawyers to look at these contracts, right? It made sense to try to right this disparity of bargaining power. And so the first one applied to beer that I can tell, and this is one where I have looked at the national picture, and I'm pretty confident that the first one applied to beer is 1971 in Massachusetts. And then you look at this list of states, and you'll see it was the 80s that really metastasized franchise law. This state in Michigan, you have it in 1984, but Texas 1981, Florida 1987, and then you have a few states filling it in later. In fact, one of my first projects as a liquor lawyer was back in the mid 1990s when we saw that this New York franchise law, beer franchise law, was likely to pass, and we had a brewer, a well-known craft brewer, looking to possibly make a move before the franchise law kicked in. And that was one of my early projects 25 years ago as an associate. Colorado doesn't go franchise until 2007. And to this day, California is what I would call a franchise light state. It has some provisions that look like a franchise law. Most of those enacted in the very late 1990s and early 2000s, but it doesn't have a comprehensive franchise law. So really, you go from a totally non-franchise market in 1970 to, by 1990, the vast majority of the country's beer wholesalers are protected by franchise laws. Okay, now continuing evolution, and we get to you guys. Back in, and I can remember I became a beer geek in the late 1980s, so I was kind of a bit of an early adopter, and we didn't call it craft beer. We called it microbreweries. And microbreweries, you can trace things to, everybody knows the story of Fritz Maytag, everybody knows New Albion Brewing, but really the 1980s and 90s, they start coming on the scene and getting noticed by people. And in many ways, that itself was a result of a legal evolution, which was the legalization of home brewing. Everybody knows, they often ascribe it to President Carter. And as I mentioned, in connection with the National Recovery Act, of course, Congress makes the law, although the president has to sign it into law. But in 1978, Congress passed a set of tax amendments, one of which legalized home brewing. And so now you've got this, what had been, akin to growing cannabis in your closet, comes out into the open. You have a new generation of people who are discovering new beer styles. They're becoming beer evangelists. They're understanding brewing history. And soon states also start following suit and legalizing home brewing. So this creates the foot soldiers for the craft beer revolution. Now, the first commercial impact, or I should say evolution that impacts commercial brewing, I think was the brew pub. Probably a year or two ago, and I can't remember why I read it, but I saw an old editorial by Charlie Papazian in one of the first, or perhaps the first issue of the New Brewer, and which was back then a publication of the, I don't even know if it was the Association of Brewers yet. It might have still been the of the AHA. But anyway, and he advocated for brew pubs and countered the sky is falling rhetoric that they were getting from critics at the time, saying you couldn't do this. And it is interesting because at the time of repeal, my research suggests that a majority, but not all states, did allow breweries to sell at retail. And if you look at the concerns, for example, toward liquor control, the concern about Tide House was all about the dangers of remote ownership, which, by the way, is hilarious now because, you know, almost all retailers are remotely owned. TGI Fridays, Walmart, Costco, they're not local businesses, but back in the 1930s they said, well, we want these local people to be in charge because, you know, if they do terrible things like overserve people, well, then the local community is going to be angry at them. Well, that is such a quaint notion now. But anyway, because that was one of the primary concerns, the other concern was this idea of the local monopoly, that the local brewer was going to buy up all the local pubs and sort of lock out competition. And by the way, that fear was stoked by the big brewers who didn't want the small regional brewers to be able to protect themselves from the influx of the more cheaply produced national brands, which of course benefited from economies of scale. There's actually a letter from August Bush II to President Taft in the 1920s saying, you need to, I think it was Taft, yeah, or maybe Coolidge. Anyway, but it's a remarkable letter. He says, you know, oh, you should get rid of this prohibition. It's a nightmare. You know, you can collect taxes. And oh, by the way, we know that the pre-prohibition saloon was terrible, but we know how to control that now, and it's by banning Tide House. So there was even rent seeking in those original Tide House laws. But all of those concerns mostly would only be concerns if you were selling retail outside of your local brewery. And so selling at your brewery was generally allowed, but you couldn't run a full service restaurant. You couldn't pour wine, you couldn't pour spirits. So you did need to change the law to allow modern brew pub operations. And that's exactly what starts happening beginning in the 1980s and quickly becomes the norm. And again, this was one that in many states, the local interest, was it whether it was the wholesalers or the restaurants, said, oh, this is terrible, the sky is going to fall, and yet now it is part of the scene. Now, one of the interesting bits that happened there is to legalize the brew pub. A lot of states said, well, a brew pub's just really a restaurant and they happen to make their own beer, sort of like a restaurant that makes their own bread. And because they are now classified as retailers, to this day, there are restrictions often on brew pubs that, now that the lines between brew pub and tap room have been blurred, can be very difficult for brew pubs. But since then, there's been a continuous evolution, and you know, I'm just going to list some of them. Number one is there's been the blurring of the lines, as I just referred, between a true brewery and a brew pub. You know, I think back in the day, and I can even remember, you know, 25 years ago, you would have thought, for even a craft brewery, there was a packaging brewery and maybe they had a tasting room, but for the most part, that was all about packaging and selling around to restaurants, oftentimes or usually through wholesalers. And then you had the idea of a brew pub, which is more of a restaurant concept. Well, the tap room sort of blurs the two, right? And in fact, depending on the rights that are given to breweries in a given state, how far they look like a brew pub, maybe with some food, or like a packaging brewery because they're putting things out in 6-packs and also selling them locally, depends. So there's been this huge blurring there. There's off-premise retail rights. That's another one that, if you look at the original pre-prohibition statutes, and I've only looked at a few states, but it was not completely uncommon where it wasn't permitted or perhaps had been taken away. You're seeing more states grant that. Then you have a further blurring between packaging brewery and on-premise brewery with the growler and the crowler, right? I have my local favorite, what they call in Maryland, a farmer brewery, and they have crowlers to go. And in fact, I can get those crowlers now at a few retailers in my county. So are they a packaging brewery? Well, they would say, look, we don't have a conventional canning line, we don't have a conventional bottling line, but they've blurred those lines. And then finally, and this one is the most interesting in some ways, is you do have this concept of remote retail locations being authorized. You know, in California, each brewery location can have 6 duplicate licenses, so 6 remote satellite tap rooms. And those tap rooms actually can have food as well. So they look a lot like brew pubs. Well, hold on. Now that starts looking like a Tide House. And by the way, I'm not sure that's bad. I'm just pointing out that is probably the one piece here where if you went back to your average lawmaker in 1934 and said, would you allow this? They would say, no way. Most of this other stuff, I think they would have comfort with, and certainly they wouldn't have a concept of what a franchise law was or mandatory 3-tier. And then finally, reflecting the consumer, right? Consumers now are shifting, as most of the data shows, between beer, wine, and spirits much more easily and frequently than prior generations. And so some of the licensing laws are doing that. So in California now, you can have the shared wine and beer tasting rooms. So there's a blurring of those lines. I believe there's legislation that was recently passed. Actually, I take it back. It wasn't here, but that clearly allows for some low alcohol spirits. It wasn't Michigan, but low alcohol spirits now being made at breweries, being sold by beer distributors. So more and more blurring. So what's the next frontier? And let me start with a plea for unity, because coming in-house, although I'd represented BA since its founding and the old BAA for I guess 8 years, 7 or 8 years before that, now that I have an inside view, I have a lot more visibility on day-to-day activity, particularly at the state level. And there's a lot of tension between breweries of different business models. And I am here to plea that you guys need to stick together. First of all, much as we like to think that craft breweries are important, you're only one tier in one commodity of one industry. You're not that mighty. And by fragmenting further, you become even weaker. And so, the trick going forward is going to be marching under a banner of distribution reform that encompasses different things for different business models. Whether you can accomplish them all at once or one at a time, the idea should be ultimately we are going to get things that will benefit the smallest craft brewer and the largest craft brewer. Let me also start with the following. And you may be surprised to hear this after what I've talked about, but the 3-tier system largely works very well for a great number of products. But there's no way it's going to work for 8,000 American breweries. So my plea to and I would say this to the wholesalers is we don't want a revolution. You say want a revolution. Well, we don't want a revolution. We want further evolution. Just as the system's been evolving, there are a couple of common sense evolutions. I'll give you 3 that make sense, that will make the market better for the 8,000 breweries, and they will not pose any threats to both the regulation of alcohol or the health of the middle tier. And the pandemic has really underlined some of this, because American consumers, a subset of them, have said, I want a wide variety of beer, and I'm willing to travel. I'm going to vote with my feet to go to brewery premises. I'm going to wait online for beer releases to get those. Well, the pandemic, of course, turns all of that on its head. All of those old vote with your feet options either become illegal or at least become things most consumers don't feel comfortable doing. So if they can't come to the beer, which we know they want, the market has proven, then we need to find a way to get the beer to them. So first thing, self-distribution. Now, as I pointed out, there are a fair number of states where this is not a goal. This is already reality. But in the states that have a mandatory 3-tier, again, let's figure out if you're going to make this advocacy when it was imposed. My guess is in most places it's going to be like 1970 something. Self-distribution for craft brewers is important. And if you look back, as I said, almost universal, as far as I can tell, self-distribution in the 30s and 40s at a time where there weren't giant national brands, there were a lot of local brands. Well, we need to go back to the future, right? This is now a time where, again, you have a ton of small local brands. And for those small local brands, self-distribution makes sense. the remaining wholesalers, and we do have, and I saw the alcohol justice petition in California where they referred to the word duopoly a bunch, and I think that really is what you have in most markets, right? In any given metropolitan area, you have 2 full-service distributors. If you're content on handling just a few accounts in an area, maybe there's another option or 2. But for the most part, if you want to be in viable distribution, you have 2 choices. They will not have the bandwidth to cover all the hundreds of beers and the dozens and dozens of breweries in that local area. Self-distribution makes sense. And what it also does is it creates a farm team. It helps that brewer show that there's a market for a new product, and that eventually that will be a product, the products that really make it are going to be the ones that then enter 3-tier distribution. Bart Watson, who many of you probably know or at least have heard of, has done some number crunching, and he's found that states with, now, of course, we will fully recognize that there's a difference between correlation and causation. We can prove correlation. We can't prove causation. But there is a correlation between higher craft brewing employment and states that allow self-distribution. But more surprisingly, there is even a slightly higher employment at the wholesale businesses for states that allow self-distribution versus states that don't. So the idea that self-distribution is going to be a major economic impediment to the wholesale tier is simply false. And then finally, retailers get a little bit more choice. Now, we all know that the chains aren't going to start buying from a small brewery that probably can only serve a couple of the chain's locations. But for that mom and pop retailer that's trying to distinguish themselves, that restaurant that wants the perfect beer selection, why not? So the second frontier that we think is very important and sensible is direct-to-consumer shipping. Now, we've gotten a taste of this because of COVID. You have these state emergency orders that have allowed to-go shipments, and to-go shipments even by normally on-premise retail establishments, tap rooms, and more importantly, brew pubs. You also have delivery that's been allowed. In some states, you can deliver through a third party, maybe a DoorDash. In others, you can't. But the point is that consumers have seen this, and the sky hasn't fallen. The other thing, though, to remember is that home delivery is already the reality. Most states allow direct-to-consumer interstate, between state shipments by wineries to their consumers. Hey, beer has less alcohol than wine. Why shouldn't beer be included there? And then intrastate by off-premise retailers in a majority of states. In the case of wine, by the way, from wineries, it's 46 states, if you include DC as a state now. So it's nearly universal. For intrastate shipping by on-premise, I said it again, off-premise retailers, it's a substantial majority, probably not as big an overwhelming majority as wine, but it's still very, very common. So why not breweries? And, in light of the pandemic, it's going to resonate with consumers, it's going to resonate with lawmakers, it's going to resonate with regulators. It just makes sense to do this. Purchasing directly from wineries, now there were studies done in the 2000s by the Federal Trade Commission, lowers prices and increases selection, and we have the model. This has been the law in an increasing number of states, but with wine starting back in the 1990s. So the idea, and I remember, like, before Granholm, the opponents of direct-to-consumer shipping, led of course by the wholesale tier, said, oh my God, the sky is going to fall. I remember talking to one naive regulator who's she was one of the 3 commissioners in a major states, right? She said, oh, I feel really bad for the wholesalers if the Supreme Court, decides that Granholm can't regulate wine like that. All the wholesalers are going to be out of business in a year or 2. And I looked at her like, wow, you've drank the Kool-Aid, but the sky hasn't fallen despite reports that it would. So it makes sense. And the final point is it's almost impossible to enforce the current restrictions. And so what you have is brewers aren't shipping, but you have tons of people on websites like on auction websites that are selling beer direct to consumer, and that's untaxed and unregulated. like the lesson of prohibition, if you give people a licit option, a legal option, you're going to dry up that much more dangerous black market. So the final piece of distribution law reform, we think, which makes a lot of sense, is franchise law reform. You've got a different time in the industry. You know, the days when it was the mom and pop needing protection against the great big brewer died. By the way, I'm not here to advocate for a repeal of franchise laws. If the big brewers want to make that case because their wholesalers have gotten so big, let them. But as applied to craft brewers, and I mean even bigger craft brewers, it is absolutely nonsensical. Large wholesalers already have all the economic and all the legal advantages when it comes to the ability to pay lawyers, the ability to have to drive a hard bargain, right? They're duopolists in their market. To give them special legal protections makes no sense. And in fact, I'll go further. This is the ultimate form of corporate welfare, right? You now have 2 or 3 millionaire or billionaire families in a state. Maybe in a state like Michigan, you have a dozen, but these are a very small number of very wealthy businesses. To give them the legal advantage over little struggling new mom and pops like you is crazy. And let's face it, it's impossible virtually to end a relationship unless the wholesaler wants to, and therefore it facilitates brand collecting. And brand collecting, remember, a lot of the regulations were concerned with, local monopolies and these sort of things. Well, brand collecting is the ultimate anti-competitive process. It's, I want this brand, but I don't want this brand so that I can make it a go of it, so I can sell it to consumers. I want it so I can make sure it doesn't compete with me by going to the distributor across the street. That is an abuse of the system. You also have a barrier to entry to new wholesalers, right? Number one, it's almost impossible to leave the old wholesalers without a payment of a significant ransom. In effect, you've given that equity to the wholesaler, and so it's very hard. That's a barrier to entry to new competitors coming in. And more importantly, if you're a brewer and you know that once you start doing business with a wholesaler, you're kind of stuck with them forever, would you ever go with an untested wholesaler? No, you're going to go with the duopolist because at least they're the safe argument. And you hear wholesalers make arguments like, oh, well, without franchise laws, we'd have no incentive to develop new brands. Really? Well, first of all, you're making a healthy margin, in fact, a much better margin than most distribution businesses make on every case you sell. Why wouldn't you want to maximize that? And then more importantly, look at how well wine and spirits are doing in a market that's much less franchised. I mean, there are some wine and spirits franchise states, but not the big ones, and much smaller. I think there's 12 for spirits, and for wine, it's, I think, 23. And again, not California, not New York, not Illinois, not Florida, not Texas, not the major markets. Another argument that you hear is, well, we need the franchise laws because if it weren't for the franchise laws, the big brewers, they would force us to do, the bad brewers would force us to do all sorts of illegal things. Well, as I said, I'm not here to advocate for repealing the franchise laws vis-a-vis the big brewers. And if they can't protect themselves against small brewers, what does that say about their desire to comply with the law? But more importantly, let's look at the track record, TTB. Let's look at state regulations. There have been plenty of examples of wholesalers violating the trade practice law. So the idea that it would only be the brewer forcing the distributor into violations of the tied house laws is just frankly nonsensical. So that's what I've got. I hope this was interesting and informative, and we have some time for questions and answers. So I'm really looking forward to it.
All right. That's my pal, Mark Serini. So he's a really sharp mind and very enthusiastic, obviously. And you can imagine, so I met him in the late 90s, and you can imagine that as a small brewer trying to fight your way through this stuff, it feels pretty good to have somebody like that on your side. So, I had some notes. looking through that, some things I wanted to clarify on. And before we get into the next slide, I want to make sure that if you guys have questions about anything Mark said, that we leave room for that right now. So some notes, one note I made was when he says, one case and you're bound, what that means is that the minute you sell, and this is true in Michigan and in most states, is that if you, and I'm speaking to beer at the moment, because beer is franchised in Michigan, wine and spirits are not. And we'll cover some differences with spirits in a second. If you sell a case of beer to a wholesaler, you are now in a franchise protected relationship. So you don't have an agreement, which means you don't have a defined territory, you don't have defined performance or cause or anything like that. But all the state regs apply. So it means that you can't leave without cause, you can't disapprove a transfer without good reason, et cetera. So that idea that an invoice initiates a relationship and gives you a de facto agreement is really important to note, because one could cross that threshold without knowing it. And, thinking you're in a handshake agreement and we don't need contracts, we're cool. Well, you have a contract. It's just limited by whatever the state says this relationship is bound by. You have terms, you just didn't get to add any color to them. And then again, reiterating the fact that you can't waive state defined terms, but you can sort of characterize them, meaning we have a sales goal, we're going to meet annually, we're going to do this, we have expectations set, you're responsible for Kent County, not Kalamazoo County. All that stuff is in the agreement. But if you just sell them a case of beer on a handshake, none of it's in the agreement except for the fact that you're bound. So hopefully I didn't reiterate that too much, but it's very important to note for starting breweries because it gets missed and it can cost you. If that distributor, which there are at least, well, there's one statewide beer distributor in the state. There arguably two. Depends on how you look at it. But I mean, that point is sort of secondary to the fact that if you signed up with a statewide distributor for your home county, but you don't define the territory, they have rights to the entire state. They can prevent you from signing up another wholesaler. Whether they're selling beer in the UP or not, they would be able to make an argument that that they acquired those when you sold them a case of beer. So very important to I think it was brought up last week that, there are certain things you need to hire people for. If you're going into distribution, you don't need to spend a lot of time with attorneys and you don't need a 10-page agreement, but you want to spend a little time and you want to have an agreement, plain and simple, because franchise law is your agreement otherwise. So some of the spirits differences I wanted to make is that oftentimes spirits do not have, franchise law doesn't apply to them, and or wine. Why is a good question, but partly is the strength of the beer wholesalers and just sort of the reality of what was happening with the movement, I think, in terms of the timeline, which is one of those discoveries for me. I came into the business in the early 90s. I would have bet money that franchise law existed since Prohibition, because that's what the wholesalers and that's what the industry tells you. It's just like, this is the way it is. Adapt. And I would have never guessed that Michigan franchise law went in 1980. It seemed like it was centuries old when I started. So anyways, that current movement, it didn't address spirits. I would speculate that one of the reasons is that spirits has got its own battles, being higher alcohol, and historically lower number of producers. It was just a different landscape. But what spirits has that's covered, we'll go into more detail next week in terms of regulatory environment, is a lot of times spirits will have state controls on it that beer doesn't have. For instance, in Michigan, a state could said, like what he said, the initial recommendations coming out of Prohibition was states ought to control all alcohol. There should be no independent retailer license. And in some states, that's the case. You have, what they'll call it, like the Alcohol Beverage Commission, the ABC, or what would be the MLCC. And sometimes the retailers are state controlled. I don't know the current state of affairs in some states, but Kansas, in order to get spirits, you had to go to a state retailer. And sometimes that applies to beer and wine, but a lot of times beer, because it was sort of the everybody's beverage and more common and lower alcohol, lower threat, was allowed to be privatized more. And so spirits, sometimes these things don't apply because they're not even letting independent businesses sell it. And in Michigan is still a control state. It's been blurred and adapted to where it doesn't really look like it anymore. But in the state of Michigan, the distiller sells their product to the state, and the state used to deliver it to the retailer. Now the state privatized the distribution, but it's very weird in that, and I may be getting off track here and into next week, but so the spirit distributors in Michigan are privately owned, but they never really own the alcohol. The alcohol is just delivered by them. And the minute they deliver it to a retailer, an invoice happens between the distiller and the retailer. So that there's this transactional protection. And so you can't franchise that because the distributor doesn't own the spirit. They never took possession. So there's a freedom of spirits to move in some regards, but they got a different set of handcuffs. And wine is generally, again, it's all state by state, but wine generally has a lot more freedom of movement. And I'm not sure why, other than it was kind of viewed differently. And one more note is that, he mentions Granholm, and so that would perk your ears up as a Michigander. And so there was a Supreme Court decision, Granholm v. I don't remember who, but it came down that's what allowed shipment of especially wine, shipment of out-state winery producers. So the decision was you can't treat an in-state winemaker differently than you can treat an out-of-state winemaker. So if you're allowing shipping for in-state, you have to allow it for out-of-state. That was a big deal because people were worried about the distribution thing and everything. So if that comes up in regulatory environment, I'll have more details on that. I haven't looked at that in a while. It happened in the late 90s, early 2000s, I think. I'm not sure. But it's recent history, and that's what he's mentioning when he says Granholm says. He's not talking about the person. He's talking about the precedent, the legal precedent of that case. So if we need to get into that, we will. It did not apply to beer or spirits for that matter. So those are a couple of notes on things that I pulled out. Does anybody have anything else that was of interest? It's a high volume of information, and it's intense, but it is the environment we work in. And I like that he was able to show all the way from the history to what evolution we're hoping for in the future.
Fred, I worked in industrial distribution, and a lot of the same thing, kind of the same things would apply. But I think it was more of an agreement between the manufacturer and the distributor and what area you would sell in, and you couldn't sell, competing brands of the manufacturer. But it seemed like most of the time the manufacturer would, if they got a lead, they would send it to the distributor. And then the manufacturer's rep, we would go into places, and if I found some, maybe some potential for sales, I'd bring in the manufacturer's rep, and then they take it away from me because it ended up being oh no, he's an OEM. We handle all the OEMs, and it's a big thing. And then they find out, oh, the guy can't pay. We're going to send it back to distribution. It was more like a personal kind of a thing. If you had a good rep from the manufacturer, we always like to take those guys around, and we sold their products. We would always push their products up. And I'm just wondering, it's the same kind of thing. It's more based on personal relationships of the distribution salespeople, and their relationship to the retailer.
Yes, so it mirrors that traditional manufacturer's rep role that's out there in a lot of industries that have a distribution tier. Where it shifts is that it's state regulated, that it's bound by state rules that can't be waived, a certain number of them. And so in other industries, that's a voluntary thing, and they can write whatever agreement they want, and they can write the conditions for release of brand, like, hey, if you don't hit the sales goal, you're done, and that's it. Or there's a no cause out, so my only out is I'm going to give you 60 days notice. So those parties in a non-franchise industry have the ability to write their agreement to suit their relationship. And one of the shifts here is that that's influenced by the state alcohol code. But other than that, it is definitely a analogy that makes a lot of sense. But if you are, I imagine in an auto part situation, if you don't like the job your distributor's doing, you don't have a complex route to get out of that agreement.
Hey, Fred, is that clip going to be accessible through the?
Yeah. So it should show up as it in this class video. You'll just have to drag to that moment. And if there's any reason that shared screen doesn't show up in the recording, right, I have the native video, so I'll just upload that separately.
Okay, thanks. I'd like to.
It is not currently shared publicly because that was behind the conference registration wall. So hopefully the class video that's posted suffices, because I don't have an outside public link to.
No, that's fine. I just want to be able to see it. I got to see things a couple of times and to really, to go through it. There's a bunch of stuff that was there.
Oh yeah, especially with Mark. But,
I'm a nuts and bolts guy. I'm not the, that was a lot.
You got to pedal fast to keep up. Now, in terms of what I expect to be, I'll go through my notes as well, but in terms of what I expect to be test worthy information is most of the stuff on the slides that's bullet pointed. I can't say that I won't pull something from Mark's talk, but the bulk of it I've represented on the slides otherwise. And I'm going to try to scan and see if there's something that I'm drawing from that wasn't represented elsewhere. But some of that is support for you to understand this and not necessarily going to be in a test answer. But yes, I do encourage you from a business point of view, absorb that as much as you can, because he has a perspective. I mean, I love the way he calls it like it is too, and says that's false, this is false, because the wholesalers are going to, and I have some of my best relationships are wholesalers. So I'm a fan. I'm supporting of 3-tier as well. I was the liaison between the two, so I have positive relationships on both sides. But as a segment, they are a protective tier that's going to preserve their rights because they have the best deal going. And so, like, I looked up a link that was previously used, and it was a national wholesaler's take on why the 3-tier system exists. And I was like very frustrated. It was propaganda. It was like the 3-tier system is keeping you from dying. And it's just not the case. So I do encourage you to go back, because Mark is a treasured resource that can cut through the theoretical advantageous sort of propaganda and say, here's why, here's what, and here's how you navigate it. There's a lot there. And yes, it will be posted is the short answer. Anybody have other stuff before I jump in? I'm going to kind of, I've got another slide here that's kind of talking about what we do with this information that'll lead up to some stuff in the future, some of it later on in the class. But prior to that, I know that was a lot, so I just want to welcome conversation. Okay. So with that, we'll jump into the next slide. Okay, so now we've got that structure of the three-tier system on the left. And that's there for kind of reference point, shrunk a little smaller to give us room for the right side. And so when and where does it apply? So I've already mentioned that with beer, franchise law applies when you're in a given state, and it relates to their code, and it applies at the first transaction or at the signing of an agreement if you sign prior to the transaction. It applies to wine and spirits when a state indicates it, which is much less common, which we already talked about. So how does it affect your distribution strategy? Well, like I mentioned, week 11, we're going to cover how to build a distribution strategy. But the point here, I just want to start getting looking above the view of just the terrain and saying, so why would this matter? Well, it might determine whether I go to a given market, whether I'm ready to go to a market. It's going to determine the preparation I need to do to assign a distributor, because you're married once you start. So you best be making a good decision that's a good fit. It can affect the size of your territory, either on the amount of resources you have to do homework in terms of what territory can you reasonably evaluate, or it could just be the fact that I want this distributor in their territory is, so my territory is going to be reflected by the distributors that I choose. So it ends up also being sort of a negotiated, it's not all your whiteboard anymore. It's not just what you imagine. Now you're integrating your mission and your vision with your collaborators, with your given partners. So you're going to start to integrate some of your wholesaler strategy with your strategy, assuming that you chose somebody who's bought in, and bought in metaphorically, meaning that, you know, you have an engaging partner who's ready to go and work on your behalf. Now you're going to start thinking about, well, what does this look like? It also very much might affect when you do certain things like self-distribution. So are you going to start with distribution and grow your brand up and then go into a wholesaler? That's certainly currently a very common strategy. We've only had self-distribution. So we had self-distribution in Michigan up until 92. And then we got it back with volume limits. I'm guessing about, I don't know, within 5 years, three years ago, something like that. And then they increased the volume limit a year ago. So self-distribution is a newly acquired opportunity for a starting brewery to say, I'm going to get my beer to retail prior to connecting to a wholesaler who I can't leave. And I'm also going to probably, you know, to your question earlier, Hannah, I'm in a in-state geography. I can create that call for my brand that they kind of need to warrant bringing you on, and I kind of need to sort of demonstrate my value to a wholesaler. Why should you add another brand to an already big book, and how is it going to get moved, and are the retailers going to say yes? That can be developed by self-distribution, by getting people drinking the beer. But self-distribution means you've got to deliver it, you've got to invoice it, you've got to manage all the sort of data points, for lack of a better word. And so that's gonna take hours or additional personnel or what have you. But you can see that, okay, if I understand this framework and what my options are, I can bring that into my planning stage, and it can even affect, prior to planning, can affect what I think we're capable of as a company. So where do you go for information? So in general, This is similar to an answer we had last week, which is you start, finding the state code, going to the state liquor control, looking up that information, finding out what are the rules for your state. And, the first thing are these major levers. Is there a franchise law? Does it affect my product category, meaning beer, wine, or spirits? And then what are the rules? And getting the code is, likely going to be it's rather dry reading. And if you're not an attorney, some things may be confusing. But I do recommend getting as much research done so that you have good questions, so that when you do hire an attorney, you understand what they're talking about, and you're not paying for that first round of research where they're just explaining to you what things mean. They could instead be saying, you could be saying, I have a question about this particular thing, and how does it apply to me? So getting that started, and then also your associations, national, state, category, not just by product, but by tier. So that means reaching out to your Brewers Guild, your local wholesaler association, your liquor commission is different. We might have, so that's not an association, but there are sometimes offshoots. But the Michigan Licensed Beverage Association is one of the retailer associations. So looking around and finding the organizations that are representing all three tiers, because they often have primers and educational opportunities. The Michigan Beer and Wine Wholesalers Association is both an ally and an opponent, and sometimes an adversary, and sometimes your savior. They speak at a lot of our producer conferences. They will, their head counsel or their executive director will come in and give a do's and don'ts about alcohol regulations. They'll speak on a panel about franchise law with brewer people. So even though there are times when this can look very oppositional, like, how is it fair that they have all these protections? Mark spoke to this, but just to reiterate it, franchise law was created in a time to protect the wholesalers from large brewers. So now it's inverted. You have large wholesalers and small brewers, and so it doesn't work very well at times. And that's why there's a need for reform, which is what he's speaking to. But that reality that there's some unfair rules, and that there are sometimes abuse of the system and manipulation of those unfair rules that can make you want to tear your hair out, does not mean there aren't positive resources and good partners and ethical collaborators in that tier. It just means you need to find them, and you need to know what you're doing in order to sort of develop that opportunity. And we'll get more into that, I think, on the distribution class, but I just want to make sure that you don't rule out getting information from those organizations. Sometimes you need to sort of filter it and realize that they're speaking in a way that's going to defend what they want to see, or what they see. So it may require a little filter at times, but there are great resources there. So producer paths. Today's class isn't intended to break these down. It's intended to, again, sort of illustrate the paths. That one is figuring out how to survive and be legal, and to not unintentionally break the law and get yourself in trouble, or get yourself in a disadvantageous situation that you didn't realize you were doing. And then there's strategic, which is, how am I going to accomplish my goals within this framework? So deciding your method for how to get through this is really another path. So, and that's a different class. And I just wanted to point out how they can influence one another. And then also here, this other note is that the FAA Act, which was mentioned, and COLAs, which are certificate of label approval, which are federal label approvals that you need for your beer to be in the marketplace, or spirit or wine, alcohol. Colas apply to all. Those rules and some other things pulled from, well, not pulled from, but some other things that were covered and discussed in Mark's talk. Next week, we're going to cover that in regulatory environment. So if some of that feels like it hasn't been addressed, feels a little Greek, then realize we're coming to it. So no homework assignment, no homework or assignment this week. Next week, we're going to cover regulatory environment. Then we're going to spend some time on midterm prep. And then we're going to have quiz 2, which covers the last 3 weeks, including this one. So mission and vision, business models, 3-tier, and franchise law. It also means that the regulatory environment class is not really covered in the quizzes, so that there will be some information that could be on the midterm that you haven't yet been quizzed on. But that's just something I want to bring your attention to. So that's where we're at. And that is 3-tier system and franchise law. It's a lot to take in. But I hopefully I've illustrated the building blocks that make it a little simpler to grasp. So we got a few minutes if anybody has questions. Otherwise, that's it for this week.
So I didn't get my act together to ask a question at the beginning of class or to talk about the last assignment. I was looking at other examples of vision statements, and they're kind of all over the place. Some are really short and like 1 or 2 sentences, and you gave us 500 words. And I was like, oh, is that, how big is it supposed to be? So mine is just bullet pointed, and it was more like just a list of like a lot of different goals I wanted to hit. Is that, I don't know, is that just like completely bad form or something I should have asked you midweek, but I didn't
I'll take a look at it. I mean, I think that, again, what I mentioned was that there are different ways to approach this. And when you Google vision statement, you're going to get a lot of things that look like mission statements. And I don't subscribe to that method. So our model was different for this assignment. Now, if you subscribe to that method after this class and you want to, businesses can define their vision and treat it as a purpose or mission statement, it's fine. But for this purpose, it was meant to describe what your business looks like in the future narratively. Okay. So if that's bullet pointed, but you're describing the things you're going to offer, that's the skeleton for a vision statement. I don't see that as wildly outside. If I do, I'll let you know. Okay. But as long as you're describing what it's going to look like, what your offerings are in the future, what it looks like to accomplish your mission, then you're in the ballpark.
Okay. Thank you.
Anybody else have takeaways from that? What was it like to do? Did it start to flush some things out? Were there any discoveries, new ideas?
Fred, I guess one thing since I've got into this program is that, old beer, and, I've been drinking beer for a long time. I never realized it, but, we used to call it, this beer is skanky, and I guess, I started looking at dates and, what the tastes and, different off flavors of old beer. And when you were in the, in the manufacturing side, how did you try to control for that? I mean, sometimes there's no date at all on the packaging. You'd have to open it up to look at the can. Some brewers don't put anything on the can. And so then the wholesalers and the distributors, then they don't seem to, if they have the time, they're just like putting things on the shelf, they're not checking dates and stuff. But I find some beer that's like 2 years old in some places. And it just seems like and I guess that's when I was looking at my, what do I want my business to look like in 5 years? That's why that self-distribution was so attractive in an area that I could handle, that I could really control for that one thing. Because, you get somebody that tries your beer for the first time and it's, it's been warm and it's gone bad, and they'll never try it. That first impression is so critical. So I just wondering, is that something that in your experience you had to deal with?
Yes, absolutely. And so the farther back you go in time, the less rigorous some of that was, especially in the craft brewing world, because you have to have, at least in the 90s, you had to have a certain wherewithal technically to be able to date code a bottle. I mean, most of the bottling lines at the early microbrewers weren't that sophisticated. The labelers, it just wasn't going to happen. I remember the guys on the bottling line were taking like a date stamp that you would use, in an office and hitting the side of the case with it. So we were date coding cases, but once that 6-pack was pulled out, that provenance was gone. So on the shelf at the retailer, you didn't know. At the wholesaler, you knew because it was still in the case. And then as, businesses grew up, and as the supply side for equipment was able to sell smaller systems, then, you have this convergence of breweries being able to afford a labeler that has a date coder. And so that just is the first opportunity you have to deal with it at retail. Then you have to ask yourself, who's responsible? So pulling old beer from a retailer means the retailer's getting refunded. So who's paying for the beer? Is it the wholesaler? Is it the brewer? Are you splitting it? That is all in the agreement. And if you don't have one and you want the beer to be pulled from retail, it's on you. So now a small brewer has to say, I got to give that money back, even though, whose fault was it? Well, it didn't sell through. When was it delivered? How much time did it have? Was it rotated? Was it a rotation issue in the warehouse? So all of a sudden you start to work backwards and go, oh, so to really be managing this wholesaler, I need a policy on rotation, and I need a policy on date code. And like, hey, if there's old beer in the marketplace, it's on you. And so there's different ways to do it. But it takes forethought, because if you're trying to do it once the old beer is out there, it's going to cost you.
Wasn't there? I'm sorry.
I was just going to add one more thing that, I remember having a blended approach where I said, you can return beer the wholesaler could return beer with a certain amount of life left in it. So I think it might have been 30 or 60 days. If you bring the beer back to me and I can sell it somewhere else or sell it in our tasting room, I'll credit you for it. If it only has 20 days left on it, then it's a distributor's poor rotation or poor management. Well, even without the word poor on it, the problem wasn't averted in the wholesale warehouse. So it's your problem now instead of mine.
That was one of I forget what major, but I think it was Budweiser or something had came out it was in their advertisement trying to control that with their born on date.
Yes.
And was that Budweiser? I'm not sure.
Yeah. Born on date was Budweiser. And
it was in their advertisement, in their commercials thing.
Yeah. And so fresh beer has been, a selling point for a long time. And it certainly has been a selling point of the small brewer of saying you have access to this regional local producer. So everything's going to be more fresh, like the farmer's market idea. But if you can't demonstrate that, and you can't, and furthermore, if you can't assure that that's what's happening to the consumer, that can get a little crazy. I mean, I can't remember. My instinct, this is going from memory, my instinct is remembering that, yeah, so Anheuser-Busch was basically, making it difficult for microbrewers who didn't have bottle code dating available. So they're saying, oh, you're fresh, are you? Well, here, we're going to start a campaign telling people to look for our born on date.
Yeah. I was looking, real quick, I just going into a store, I was talking to Cage in class, and Gage, I'm sorry. When you go as far as marketing beer and, and putting it out there and stuff, and there's like the couple of places that I go to. I mean, and I'm not good at, not a discouragement at all whatsoever, but how are you going to disguise? How are you going to decorate a can? How are you going to put what face on a can to try to compete with the aisles and aisles and shelves and shelves of different kind of beers out there? I mean, to me, it's undaunting. It's like there's no way you're going to be able to drink every one of them. Just to me, it's just crazy. Could it have to be something wild or crazy? I don't know.
Yeah, that's the challenge. And yet, new breweries break through all the time. In any industry, new brands find a way to break through, even in crowded marketplace. So there's always room for something that the consumer makes room for, but it gets in the difficulty level, and the odds continue to get a little trickier the more dense a marketplace becomes. And that's true for beer and spirits. Go ahead, Hannah.
Sorry, I want to take up our last minute here. When you said earlier, answering Frank's question about having forethought when you're talking to a wholesaler, so are there any like good faith things that wholesalers have to do? Do they have any kind of like fiduciary responsibility to you, or do you just have to go in assuming that like unless you ask for it, they don't really have to give you anything other than saying they'll sell your beer for you?
There are a few things in the code which I didn't break down because I thought this bigger picture was more important. But when you go through it, there are things like if they commit fraud, they're like really fundamental breaches.
Wow.
It's not like, if they don't sell anything, there's like you can terminate for abandonment. But if they realized that abandonment termination was coming, they could just start selling a few cases. So like a lot of times you're at this disadvantage because there's a typical phrase used in franchise law about cause and cure. So if you're going to demonstrate cause, you need to give them an opportunity to fix it. So I can say you're not performing to this level, so you're on 90 days probation. And so so it's difficult to, if they're doing something, they can fix it and then keep the brand. Now, it's not just, Mark makes a good point, and I make the same point, that it is difficult to impossible to terminate in a strong franchise state, but it is not impossible. It is near impossible. What usually happens though, is that, and this gets more into strategy, so this will cover more, but usually what happens is you make a very strong case that for termination, and instead of terminating them, you're playing poker and you're saying it would make a lot more sense for you to sell this brand right now than to take me to court over this thing that I've proven you've done. Now, I've kind of veered from your question, but yes, there are a few things like they need to have their license, they can't commit fraud, selling out of territory. If they breach specific terms of the agreement, if you have an agreement, there can be certain things that are triggers for termination. That's going to be spelled out. But to get around the cause and cure thing, usually what you're doing is navigating towards a negotiated sale. So, hey, I'm going to terminate you, but if you want to keep your asset intact, you can sell to wholesaler B now, and I'm good with that. So you're almost, I was thinking about, when Mark said that, I was thinking about my history. It's like, I've terminated in Michigan. I accomplished the unaccomplishable. Well, no, I didn't. I forced a sale with threat of termination.
Okay. Yeah, just when you're talking about like rotating and stuff, so the abandonment thing makes sense. But yeah, I thought if they just like, I don't know, forgot about you, didn't get around to it, whatever,
Right.
Yeah, can they get in trouble for that?
Yeah, they wouldn't if you haven't called them on it. If you haven't started a
That
cause and cure
sucks.
period, meaning if nobody's checked in on them, if there was no sales plan, if there was no supplier rep coming in, if there were no meetings, if there was no, hey, I noticed you haven't sold anything, they're just going to say, thanks for bringing that to our attention. We'll get better.
So you're really on your own, or you should you know, even if you have a good relationship, you should plan for looking out for yourself mostly.
Yes.
Okay.
And again, that will, I'm happy it came up because it is where you should go from understanding this framework to now what do I do with it? But we are going to cover it in detail in another week about how to do that and what that looks like. And yes, the reality is that you have partners, but you're required to engage at a certain level to share that effort towards success. Same goes for spirits, even though you can leave. You know, there usually aren't a lot of options. So you're going to have, what I always said when, in, you know, the bulk of my background on this is in beer, but I did have several years of selling spirits, but the bulk of the background in franchise law is beer. And I always said, even when we were in non-franchise states, which were few, but it was like Colorado before the law change, I just said, you know, I'm just going to treat every state like it has franchise law because it sort of holds this level of engagement and keeps me protected. And it's that, like, it kind of works. So I would say the same business advice in a non-franchise law is that if you think you're going to drop your beer off and everything's just going to be rosy, that's not going to happen. So from a sales strategy point of view, you kind of need to be engaged anyways. And it just so happens that it's also going to be your framework for legal separation.
Thank you.
Anybody else? All right. Well, thanks for participation, and enjoy your week of no homework assignment. And we'll be back for week 5. See you soon.
Sounds good.
Good night, everybody.